Good afternoon. Welcome to NCMIC's inaugural Naturopath webinar series. We are using the webinars to explore a variety of topics affecting how you practice. My name is Jackie Helbrung. I'm a professional relations representative for NCMIC's Naturopathic Insurance Program. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I have a few notes I'd like to share with you. Today's webinar is pre-recorded to accommodate schedules. If you have any questions you would like to address with us, please give us a call at 800-952-9935 or submit your question through the Contact Us section of ncmic.com. We will get back to you to address your questions. Our quarterly webinars will be posted in the Naturopath resource section of ncmic.com. Today's webinar is about a legal view for telehealth in 2021 from an attorney's perspective. I'm looking forward to talking with guest speaker Stephanie Berg. Stephanie is a licensed California attorney and naturopathic doctor. She received her law degree from Stanford Law School and her naturopathic medicine degree from Bastyr University. She now practices law full-time and combines her passions and expertise by providing legal services to integrative health practitioners to build, protect, and expand their practices. Her experience working as a lawyer and as a naturopathic doctor provide her a unique perspective and ability to counsel her clients. She is particularly passionate about consulting with clients to assist them in developing their businesses online as healthcare moves more and more to a virtual interface. In addition to general business and naturopathic medical law, she specializes in telemedicine and telehealth. She is also legal counsel to California Naturopathic Doctors Association, providing legal counseling and support of their members to help advance their profession. Stephanie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here and excited to share all of the ins and outs about telemedicine. I'm sure many people already know a lot about telemedicine and have been practicing telemedicine for the past year, at least, if not longer. So I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just do want to start out the presentation with my quick legal disclaimer that this presentation is just legal information and education. Obviously, don't know everyone's individual situation, so this is just information, education, not specific legal advice. But I highly recommend, just as I would, seeking your own CPA, accountant, definitely get legal advice from someone who knows your specific situation.
Thank you for that. So let's get started. Many doctors are now practicing via telehealth. Does telemedicine mean the same thing as telehealth? And what's the difference?
Very good question. And I think there is some confusion about this. They actually mean exactly the same thing. So telemedicine, telehealth, they're often used interchangeably. And it's because states all define telemedicine, telehealth, and the rules around those individually. Each state has its own telemedicine, telehealth laws. And so some states refer to it as telemedicine, some states refer to it as telehealth. Medicare and Medicare laws, they talk about the practice of medicine virtually as telehealth. So telehealth doesn't mean health coaching virtually. It simply is the same thing as providing clinical services remotely via, like we're doing now, speaking real-time audio-visual communications. Some states actually include telephone in the definition of telehealth or telemedicine, and some states do not. So it's important to always look at the law of the state where the practice is occurring, and we will talk about where is the practice occurring and which state's laws do you look at.
Thank you. So where do I need to be licensed?
So this does get into which state's laws do you look at, which state's law applies. In the telemedicine laws, there are two different locations. They can be the same location, but they're two different sites. there is the originating site, and you'll see that, and that in the different laws and rules, and that is where the patient is physically located. Then there's the distant site, and that's where the doctor is physically located. Again, those two locations can be the same thing, but same place, or they can be different. But what is important is the doctor practitioner needs to be licensed in the state where the patient is physically located at the time of the visit. So where is the patient sitting? Where are they located? That's where you need to be licensed when you are practicing medicine. And again, that's the originating site. So that is the state's law that you look at. So if you are a naturopathic doctor and you are seeing a patient who is located in Washington, then you need to be licensed in the state of Washington. It doesn't matter where you're located as the provider, but if the patient is in Washington, when you are diagnosing, treating, and providing clinical care via telemedicine, you need to be licensed in that state, Washington, and you follow the scope of the naturopathic doctor license in Washington. Likewise, say you are the provider in Washington and your patient is in Connecticut, then you need to be licensed in Connecticut. And when you are treating that individual in Connecticut, you follow the scope of the naturopathic doctor license in Connecticut, which we know is very different scopes for naturopathic doctors between the different states. So it's very important to know which state's law you follow, where you need to be licensed, and what that state's scope is. Just to clarify, this is because the federal government gives the states the privilege and the responsibility of determining who is qualified to practice medicine and treat patients within their borders. That's just what they decided to do. There's not an easy way for the federal government to regulate that. So they give that to the states to protect the citizens of their states and determine who can practice medicine, diagnose, treat, prevent, cure disease with the individuals in that state.
Did COVID change any of this?
This is another very good question, and something that I think caused a little bit of confusion. Right after sort of about a year ago, a little bit over a year ago, a lot of states put emergency executive orders into place, and the Medicare laws changed slightly. For Medicare and telemedicine, it used to be that the doctor and the patient had to be located in the same state, and there were some actual other requirements about the doctor had to have seen the patient in person once, and it had to be the patient actually physically was in a very rural area where they couldn't get to see the doctor, and only then would Medicare cover telemedicine. So when COVID happened, everyone was quarantined. The federal government said we are going to revise the Medicare rules relating to telemedicine, and the doctor and patient don't have to be in the same state. We'll still cover it. The patient doesn't have to be in a rural area. We'll still cover it. And a lot of people thought this meant that you don't have to be licensed in the state where the patient is located. But actually, this is not the case. The Medicare rules did not change the fact that the doctor still needs to be licensed in the state where the patient is located. It just changed what Medicare would cover in terms of telemedicine. And in terms of the state executive orders that waived some of the licensing laws, those actually can be found online. You can go easily and find them at the the American Federation of Medical Boards, I believe it is, or Federation of State Medical Boards. It's they actually monthly were updating, or weekly were updating the waivers in place. The most recent one is March 2021, where they have the most updated executive orders. And what those did is they waived certain licensing requirements for out-of-state practitioners. But each state's executive order is very specific. It's not a blanket waiver that you don't need to be licensed in a state to treat patients in that state. Some of them talk about you can get a waiver if you are providing emergency care with respect to COVID, if you're working in a hospital. Many of them only refer to certain practitioners. Some of them just have a quick application you can do. So it's very state specific and not a blanket waiver that you can simply provide medical care to anyone, anywhere.
Okay, thank you. What if the patient is out of town and wants me to refill their prescription, but they are in a state where I'm not licensed? Can I do that?
Oh, very good question. Okay, so there are several things going on here. One, we always need to know, okay, where is this patient located and am I licensed in that state? Next, we look at, does the license, if I do have a license in that state where the patient is located, um, is it within the scope of practice of a naturopathic doctor in that state to prescribe? If not, and if you saw them in person or you saw them via telemedicine in the state where you are licensed when they were located there, then the best course of action is not to refill a prescription to an out-of-state pharmacy where, one, they may not recognize the naturopathic doctor license if it's a state that doesn't license naturopathic doctors, or two, it may be outside of the scope of a naturopathic doctor and you're not a licensed practitioner there. So the best thing to do would just be to refill it to the pharmacy in your state under your license within your state. And then if that pharmacy wants to transfer it out, they can certainly do that.
Okay. What scope of practice do I follow and what laws apply?
So again,
Does,
oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, does HIPAA still apply as well?
Yes, great question. And so we always want to follow the scope of the naturopathic doctor license where the patient is physically located. And this does get a little tricky for naturopathic doctors, as we know, because one, you can't get a license in every state, even if you wanted to. So really, you only are limited to that 22 states. District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, if you can actually get a license in those. So you're pretty limited, and even in the ones where you can get a license, as we know, as I've discussed, the scope of practice is very different. So you always want to follow the scope and make sure you're following the laws, rules, regulations with respect to telemedicine and practice of medicine in the state where the patient is physically located. HIPAA definitely still applies, and it's important to make sure that you do have a HIPAA compliant telemedicine platform. During the COVID emergency, there was a waiver by CMS that said they wouldn't actively punish or go after people for not having HIPAA compliant telemedicine software. However, that is bound to end soon, hopefully. And also, I think it's important for patient confidentiality to feel that you're doing your best to ensure that the communications and the healthcare practice and the information they're sharing with you is secure as can be, HIPAA compliant. And so you just want to make sure you have that. There's a lot of great software platforms out there. Many are free. Doxy.me is a free one. Many of the patient portal electronic medical record platforms actually include software in them. So there are a lot of great options out there. And Zoom is even HIPAA compliant, can be HIPAA compliant. So a lot of great options out there.
Well, that's really good information to be sharing with everybody. Do I need to see the patient in person first before seeing them via telemedicine?
So this is also a state-specific question. So it goes back to, okay, one, where's the patient located? Do I have a license in that state? And then you need to look at the telemedicine laws of that state. Most every state will say that you can actually establish the doctor-patient relationship via telemedicine. Some states say that it has to be a real-time synchronous audio-visual communication like we're having now. Others say actually just telephone is okay. And others, though, do actually require an in-person visit. Those are fewer, but for example, Hawaii does require an in-person visit. So if you're a Hawaii practitioner, Hawaii licensed practitioner, and the patient's in Hawaii, you actually are supposed to see them in person to establish care before you provide telemedicine, or you have to have a licensed Hawaii provider who has seen them in person and refers them to you. So they have done the physical exam and refer them to you. So it's always very state specific, but important thing to note on that is with telemedicine, the same standard of care always applies. So if they have a condition that warrants you see them in person first, you feel that it's standard of care to see them in person first, or to have them go see someone in person first, that's important to do because the same standard of care always applies to telemedicine as it does to in-person. So it's no excuse just to say, oh, this was telemedicine, I couldn't do the exam.
That's a good point. Thank you. Can I prescribe medications via telemedicine? And what about controlled substance?
Oh, this is actually sort of related to, do I need to see them in person? So again, you need to look at the state laws about whether you need to see them in person for a physical exam to prescribe any medications. And again, the same standard of care applies. So California, for example, is a state that says you need to do a good faith examination prior to prescribing any medications. However, the good faith examination can be via audiovisual communications, does not have to be in person, so long as it meets the standard of care. So other states are different though. So you need to look at your specific state's laws, where the patient's located. And a good example I like to provide is thyroid medication. So some practitioners may just look at someone's labs and then prescribe based on their labs and feel that that is standard of care. Other practitioners may believe that it's standard of care to palpate their thyroid first, right? Make sure they don't have nodules before prescribing anything, depending on the patient, depending on the situation. So whether you need to see them in person comes down to 3 issues. Is it within your scope of the license where the patient's located to prescribe in general? Because as we know, many states, unfortunately, the scope is not the same for naturopathic doctors across the country. And Connecticut, just as an example, can't prescribe any medications if the patient's licensed there and you're a licensed naturopathic doctor in Connecticut. So one, is the patient in a state where you can actually prescribe? And then it is what you're prescribing within your scope of practice as a naturopathic doctor there, because again, the scope, the license covers very different types of prescriptions. Some it's only natural and synthetic hormones. Some it includes everything, including controlled substances to a limited degree. Some you have to have a supervising physician to prescribe. So you need to make sure you're following all those rules. And then, is it standard of care to prescribe without an in-person visit for the condition that they have, whether that's an in-person visit with you or someone else who has seen them in person and who can tell you that, okay, I've done this physical exam, provide that information to you. And then again, looking at the telemedicine laws within the state where the patient's located. But for controlled substances, you do always need to see them in person before the first prescription of a controlled substance. This is under the Ryan-Haidt Act of 2008, and it's was mainly put in place to protect against overprescribing of opioids. And so basically, they want to make sure that it's not just someone prescribing over the internet based on a questionnaire. That was the problem that was going on. So they require that you see the patient in person at least once before a prescription of a controlled substance. That would even include testosterone, for example. During the COVID emergency, they did waive the in-person requirement. However, not certain how long that's going to extend. And I do think it's best practice so that you, one, don't have to keep watching when do I need to put this in place, but two, just to see them in person before you prescribe a controlled substance, I think is probably best practice and in keeping with the Ryan-Haidt Act for whenever that waiver of the in-person requirement goes into place.
Good point. So is there anything else I need to consider? How about informed consent for telemedicine? Anything specific in my chart notes?
Yes, all very good questions and common questions. So informed consent for telemedicine is actually legally required in most every state. Some states require a verbal consent, and some states say it has to be a written consent, informed consent. And basically, it's just like any informed consent where you're providing the risks and the benefits of telemedicine and giving them the option, knowing the risks and benefits of telling you whether they want to proceed. So what are the risks of telemedicine? Potentially you can't diagnose and treat the same as you can in person because you don't have the same information. Or perhaps the screen is blurry and you can't tell something on their skin the way you could in person. You obviously can't touch their skin. You can have people in the room perhaps helping do some sort of physical exam or take photos, but there is the risk that you may miss something that you would otherwise be able to see in person. Despite your best efforts to have a HIPAA compliant, secure video platform, perhaps there's the risk of their confidential information getting out or some sort of leak of their information. There are other things that you probably want to tell them. Okay, there's the chance that we may be disconnected during the video. What happens? What do we do then? The benefits, of course, are they don't have to travel to see you in person. There's greater access to doctor-patient relationships. Many people love the fact that they don't have to drive in traffic to get to their doctor. I especially understand that in Los Angeles. So you want to put all these things into your informed consent document, even in those states where you don't have to have a written informed consent. I think it's just best practice to have it there. Put it in their medical record, put it in your EMR, that they've signed it once, and then you're good to go. And there are certain states, again, you look at the state law where the patient's located, there are certain states that have specific language that is required to be included in their informed consent form. So those would be Arizona, Connecticut, District of Columbia, Idaho, Kansas, Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Utah, and Vermont. Those would be the states where you want to look and see what is the specific language that's required to be in my informed consent. Very easy to find, but you want to make sure you have that language in there. Probably, not going to be a huge issue, but best to be in line with your telemedicine rules and regulations. And those are just the states that require it, that license naturopathic doctors. And then once you have it in there, you conduct your telemedicine visit the same as you would, or as much as you can, similar to how you would your in-person visit. And you want to document. So who is in the room? What is the date? Where is the patient located? Anything else that you tell them, if you need to tell them to go see someone in person, that should be documented in your chart note. I think it's also nice, perhaps, many of the EMR platforms allow you to put a template in there for your chart notes. So you can just have a template of, this is the date, here is the patient's name, the patient is located at, this city, this state, they've previously signed a telemedicine consent, and if anyone else is in the room with them, a spouse, a sibling, a child, a parent, you put that in the chart notes as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, those are all really great suggestions on how to document. So with all of that, do I need to have malpractice insurance?
Yes, and actually speaking of the chart notes, that is a great thing to provide you additional insurance, because as I'm sure everyone at NCMIC knows, is that it's always best to document, because
Yes.
that is what occurred in the visit. So I do believe that it is important to have malpractice insurance, whether you're seeing patients in person or via telemedicine and important also to check with your insurance. Most malpractice policies cover telemedicine now. However, what they cover is very different. So you want to make sure and most of them will only cover you for the state where you're licensed, where you tell them you're practicing, and they'll cover you for your scope in that state. So you want to make sure that, let's say you decide, oh, I have a lot of patients in Arizona, Washington, and Connecticut, California, Maine, whatever it may be, and you want to get licenses in multiple states, want to make sure to tell your malpractice now that you have licenses in all these states and that you're providing care in these multiple states. So that's very important, because you're only going to get coverage for and under your policy for what the malpractice carrier knows you are doing. Otherwise, they can't provide a good quote for you and estimate their risk to provide you the insurance. So always be honest, 100% upfront with your malpractice carrier about what you're doing to make sure it is covered.
That is correct. I can 100% agree with you.
Good.
So what if I just have a telemedicine only practice and I don't have a regular clinic? What do you suggest on that?
This sort of gets back into sort of what I mentioned. Let's say you have patients in multiple states that do offer a license, and we're just talking about the licensed states right now.
Right.
You can, if you have a telemedicine only practice, then unless you just want to see patients, let's say you're licensed in California. California is a good a good example because it's a huge state. So if you're licensed in California as a naturopathic doctor, you can see patients all the way to the tip top of California to, the base almost to Mexico. And so long as it's standard of care to see them only via telemedicine and you're staying within your scope of your of your California naturopathic doctor license, then you're good to go. But if you do want to expand your practice and provide clinical care, diagnosis, treatment, ordering labs, providing naturopathic care within the scope of the other states to individuals located throughout the country, you may want to think about getting multiple licenses. This is what many MDs do, right? They have it a little easier because their scope of practice is the same in every state. So much easier. You get a license in multiple states. You don't have to worry about, oh, I follow this scope in this state and this scope in this state. But you could, one, get a license in states that license naturopathic doctors where the scope is pretty consistent. So Arizona, Washington, California, slight differences in California and specifics, but Oregon, some states where you can prescribe mainly the same types of things. The scope is pretty consistent. That would be an option. And then you just have to worry about, of course, applying, paying the licensing fees. These are all the costs of doing business, right? And being able to be appropriately licensed. Oregon, I believe, even offers a telemedicine only license, so sort of a more limited scope, which is a great option. So that is a really good thing if you want to have telemedicine only practice. Then you would certainly in your patient consent forms want to ensure that they have a primary care doctor who can see them in person on board, because you can't provide those in-person visits if you're 100% telemedicine, and it's important that they do those physical exams, as we know. So you'd want to make sure that you disclaim that primary care role and ensure that they have someone on board and they understand you're not taking that role on. You want to, again, along the same lines, clearly define the scope of what you're providing if you're just virtual. And then think about what can you safely provide just virtually. And maybe you want to consult instead of providing direct patient care. Perhaps you want to consult with providers in other states. Many states have exceptions for consultation where you don't actually need a license in another state if you're not providing direct patient care in that state. Rather, you are consulting with the doctor who is licensed in the state where the patient's located, who is providing the direct patient care. So that's another great option. Expand your network and help other doctors. If you have a specialty in something, fertility or GI health or whatever it may be, expand your network legally by not just providing care without a license in another state, but instead consulting with other healthcare providers. So I think that's a great option if you want to have a telemedicine only. And if you are going to get licensed in multiple states, make sure that, make sure that you, again, license appropriately, following all the rules in that state, and refer out if you don't feel that it's appropriate to do something only via telemedicine.
That was excellent information on telemedicine only practice. Thank you. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. I really thank you so much, Stephanie, for being here today, especially in our first NCMIC inaugural naturopathic webinar series. We will be doing these webinar series quarterly. So look for the information on our website at ncmic.com. And before we go, I have a few reminders for our audience. We are continually adding to our content with information to help you navigate daily and deal with challenges you are facing. We have information out there on a wide variety of topics, including COVID issues and risk management, so please check that out. This webinar will be posted to the webinar resource page. You can also keep up to date on new resources from NCMIC by following us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. In closing, I would like to thank everyone for watching. We hope the information has been helpful to you in your daily practice. Thank you, and I hope you can join us next time. And thank you again, Dr. Stephanie Berg, for being our first guest. Have a wonderful day.